The guards dragged the bloodied man across the cold concrete floor, his body leaving streaks of red in his wake. His arms were shackled behind his back with thick steel cuffs, the kind reserved for the worst criminals. His clothes, little more than torn rags, clung to him, damp with sweat, blood, and dirt. He didn't fight. Didn't struggle. Just moved with the sluggish compliance of a man too broken to resist. "Damn thing smells worse than the last one," one of the guards muttered, wrinkling his nose. "It's not a thing," the younger recruit corrected with an uneasy chuckle. "It's a man." The warden, a broad-shouldered figure with a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite, scoffed. "You call that a man?" He gestured toward the prisoner's body with a sneer. "That's a rabid dog in human skin." The cell door groaned as it opened, revealing a reinforced chamber with walls lined in thick, tempered steel. The guard shoved him inside, and he collapsed onto the ground, his breathing shallow but steady. "Lock it down," the warden ordered, and with a loud clang, the door sealed shut. The younger guard hesitated, watching the prisoner for a moment longer. There was something about him, something unsettling. It wasn't just the way he moved or how quiet he was. It was his skin, covered in old scars and something else. Marks. The guard didn't say anything, but he made a mental note. He'd seen tally marks before. Usually scratched into prison walls, signs of days counted down. But these were different. Days weren't being counted. Something else was. Matthews had been in this job long enough to know when something was wrong. And this was wrong. He wasn't like the others. The other prisoners screamed when they were thrown in the cage. They cursed. Threatened. Pleaded. This one just sat there. Matthews watched him on the monitor, the glow of the security feed painting his face in pale green. The prisoner had barely moved since being locked up. His breathing was slow. Controlled. Like a man who knew how to wait. Something nagged at him, an itch in the back of his mind. He leaned forward, squinting at the grainy image. His eyes traced the markings along the prisoner's skin, rows of careful, deliberate tallies. His stomach twisted. Matthews had seen marks like that before. Not in a place like this, but in a different kind of hell. A long time ago, in the darkest corners of war, he had heard rumors. Stories about men who didn't just kill, but kept count. Ghosts who left behind bodies and never a trace of themselves. Elite operatives. The kind of men governments didn't admit existed. And the worst of them? They didn't carve their tallies into walls. They carved them into themselves. He counted. 1 row. 2. 50. More. His hands went clammy as he realized just how many there were. And then he saw something else. A different kind of mark. One he had only ever seen once before, on a man whose name wasn't spoken in official reports, whose existence was nothing more than whispers among those who had seen too much. Classified kills. Matthews swallowed hard. His pulse hammered against his ribs. He turned away from the monitor, and nearly knocked over his coffee. "We need to move him." The other guard raised an eyebrow. "What?" "This isn't a prisoner," Matthews said, voice tight. "It's a goddamn executioner." Before he could say another word, the lights flickered. Then went out. An alarm blared. A lockdown sequence had just been triggered. The facility was built like a fortress, thick walls, reinforced doors, the latest security systems. None of it mattered. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the alarm. It was the silence. "Power's out," someone said over the radio. "Backup systems aren't responding." Then came the real problem. "He's gone." The warden turned to the security screens, expecting to see a broken cell door, some brute force escape attempt. Instead, he saw nothing. No broken locks. No forced doors. The cell was still intact. But the prisoner was gone. "Check the feeds," the warden barked. The security officer scrambled, flipping through the camera angles. There. A hallway. Empty 1 second. Then, in the flickering emergency lights, a shadow. Not running. Not panicked. Just moving. The warden's blood ran cold. Lock every exit, he ordered. Full lockdown. Now. But deep down, he knew. They weren't locking him in. They were locking themselves inside with him. There was no record of his name. No official file. No birth certificate. If he had ever existed in the eyes of the government, that information had been buried so deep that even the best intelligence officers couldn't dig it up. The name they gave him in the program was Cain. Matthews knew that name. Knew it the way old soldiers knew the names of ghosts that haunted their worst memories. Cain wasn't just a soldier. He wasn't even a man, not in the way others were. He was something else, something created in the spaces where rules and morality didn't apply. The government had spent billions creating their perfect weapon, an elite program that took the best, broke them, and reforged them into something unrecognizable. They turned men into killers so refined, so precise, that war was no longer about numbers. It was about them, a handful of operatives capable of toppling entire regimes. And Cain had been the best of them. But then, one day, he disappeared. No official report. No funeral. Just gone. They assumed he was dead. They were wrong. Cain had never been a man who questioned orders. His training had stripped that from him early on. The mission came first. The kill came first. Thought was secondary, hesitation was a weakness. Until one day, something changed. It wasn't a mission that should have stood out. Another high-value target. Another job buried in a stack of black-inked files. But this time, something had been different. No one knew exactly what had happened. Some whispered that Cain had hesitated, that for the first time in his brutal career, he had flinched. Others believed the mission wasn't what it had seemed, that the target had been someone Cain wasn't supposed to kill, that the people who sent him hadn't told him everything. What was undeniable was the aftermath. The mission had been successful. But everyone involved had died. Not just the target. Not just the guards. The entire squad that had been sent with Cain. Wiped out. No bodies were ever recovered, but the aftermath was clear. Something had happened that day. Something that had shattered Cain in a way no amount of training could repair. And then, just like that, he was gone. No reports. No explanations. The government did what it did best, pretended it never happened. It was easier to erase a ghost than to admit it had ever existed. But Cain wasn't the kind of ghost that stayed buried. The guards were scrambling now, weapons drawn, barking orders at one another. The warden stood in the control room, gripping the edge of the console so hard his knuckles turned white. "Find him," he growled. "Now." But they wouldn't. Matthews knew that. This wasn't an escape attempt. Cain wasn't running. He wasn't trying to break out. He was hunting. Matthews had seen it before. The precision. The patience. The quiet, creeping inevitability of it. Cain had been underestimated from the moment they dragged him into this facility. They had treated him like an animal. But he was never the prey. He was the predator. And now, he was reminding them of that fact. The warden turned to Matthews. "You recognize him," he said, voice sharp with accusation. "Tell me what we're dealing with." Matthews exhaled slowly. "We're already dead." The warden's face twisted with fury. "The hell does that mean?" Matthews didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the screen, to the security feed showing the empty hallway where Cain had last been seen. Except it wasn't empty anymore. There was something written on the wall. Blood-red letters, smeared with deliberate precision. "I've killed more than you've met." The warden took a step back. For the first time, real fear flickered in his eyes. "Lock everything down," he rasped. But it didn't matter anymore. Cain was already inside. The first guard died before he even knew he was being hunted. He had been moving through the lower corridors, weapon drawn, heart pounding. The emergency lights flickered above him, casting the hallway in an eerie red glow. His breath came fast and shallow as he turned a corner, scanning the empty passage ahead. Then the power cut out completely. For 2 full seconds, there was only darkness. And in that darkness, something moved. By the time the lights flickered back on, the guard was gone. The second and third guards found his body minutes later. His neck was twisted at an impossible angle, eyes frozen wide in terror. His weapon was still in his hand, fingers stiff against the trigger. No gunfire. No struggle. Just dead. That was the moment panic set in. The radios exploded with frantic voices. "He's picking us off! He's inside the perimeter! He's not escaping! He's killing us! What the hell is this guy?" It didn't matter how many men they had, how many weapons they carried. Cain wasn't a prisoner anymore. He was a shadow, moving through the facility like a ghost with unfinished business. And none of them were getting out alive. Cain didn't just kill them. He broke them. It started with the messages. Not just the ones scrawled in blood on the security room wall. No, that was just the beginning. As the guards moved through the facility, they found more. Carved into doors. Scratched onto the steel panels. Written in crimson streaks across their own fallen men. "You are already dead. You locked yourselves in with me. 3 steps behind you." That last one sent one of the guards into a blind panic. He turned, opened fire down an empty hallway, screaming. The others barely had time to react before he turned the gun on them, convinced they were the ones who would turn first. Cain didn't need to kill all of them. He let fear do it for him. The warden tried to regain control, barking orders through the intercom. But his voice was drowned out by the chaos spreading like wildfire. Guards were abandoning their posts, splitting into smaller, frantic groups, trying to fight an enemy they couldn't even see. And the security feeds? They were useless. Every time someone thought they saw Cain on a screen, he was already gone by the time they got there. He wasn't running. He was waiting. Letting them panic. Letting them make mistakes. And then, when they were the weakest, that was when he struck. The deeper Cain moved into the facility, the quieter the radios became. The shouting. The orders. The desperate, panicked voices. One by one, they fell silent. By the time he reached his destination, only static remained. The warden had sealed himself in the central control room, the last stronghold of the facility. Reinforced doors. Bulletproof glass. A direct line to the outside world, if only he could get a signal through the lockdown interference. But none of that mattered. Because Cain wasn't here to escape. He was here for the files. The real reason he had let himself be captured in the first place. Deep inside the control room was a restricted terminal, locked behind layers of security. Classified information on the people who made him, the ones who had trained him, turned him into what he was, and then abandoned him. He didn't need passwords. He didn't need codes. He just needed time. As his fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up the buried data, he caught his own reflection in the dark screen. The tally marks on his skin. The numbers that had once meant something. For the first time in years, he wondered what it would feel like to stop counting. Then, as the last firewall broke and the names appeared on the screen, he pulled a knife from his belt. And slowly, carefully, he carved something into the steel panel beside the terminal. When the warden's men finally reached the control room, all they found was a single phrase, burned into the metal like a promise. "I've killed more than you've met." And Cain was gone. The warden sat alone in the control room, gripping the pistol in his trembling hands. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, his eyes darting between the security monitors. Most of the feeds were static now, useless. The ones that still worked showed nothing but empty hallways littered with bodies. He had spent years building this fortress. He had designed it to be inescapable, unbreakable. The men under his command had been the best, trained to handle the worst criminals imaginable. And yet, in a single night, one man had turned it into a graveyard. The warden tried to tell himself that Cain was just another killer. That, at the end of the day, he bled like anyone else. But the part of his brain that still clung to logic, the part that wasn't drowning in terror, knew the truth. Cain wasn't a man. He was something else entirely. The radio crackled to life, and the warden nearly jumped out of his skin. A faint voice came through, shaky and breathless. "He's not human," the guard whispered. "He's not." The transmission cut off. Silence. The warden forced himself to stand. His knees felt weak, his body sluggish. But he wasn't going to die hiding in a room. If Cain wanted him, he'd have to come through him. He turned off the safety on his pistol, squared his shoulders, and took a deep breath. Then the monitor directly in front of him flickered. The grainy image cleared. And Cain was staring right at him through the camera. The warden's blood turned to ice. Cain didn't move. Didn't blink. Just watched. Then, slowly, deliberately, he smiled. The warden's hands shook. And the lights went out. He fired blindly in the dark. The muzzle flashes lit up the control room in violent bursts, but the bullets hit nothing. The room was empty. The warden knew better than to hope that meant Cain was gone. He fumbled for the emergency panel, slamming his fist against it until the dim backup lights flickered on. His breathing was a sharp, ragged noise in the silence. And then, a whisper. From right behind him. "You should have fed me scraps." The warden spun around, but Cain was already moving. The gun was knocked from his hand, clattering uselessly to the floor. A steel grip clamped around his throat, shoving him back against the console. Cain wasn't in a hurry. He never was. The warden clawed at the hand around his neck, but it was like fighting against iron. His vision swam, his pulse a wild drumbeat in his ears. Cain leaned in close, his voice a quiet, measured rasp. "You made a mistake." The warden's lips trembled. Cain didn't let him finish. The knife slid in fast, a clean, practiced motion. No wasted movement. No hesitation. The warden sagged, his breath leaving him in a quiet, gurgling rasp. His body slumped against the console, head lolling forward. Cain didn't bother watching him die. He had already moved on. The alarms stopped. The gunfire stopped. The facility, once filled with the shouts of armed men, was silent. The few remaining guards who hadn't been slaughtered cowered in locked rooms, refusing to come out. They weren't soldiers anymore. They weren't protectors of the law. They were survivors, waiting for the nightmare to end. By the time they worked up the courage to leave, Cain was already gone. The control room door was ajar, and inside, the warden's body sat slumped over in his chair, eyes empty, blood pooling beneath him. But what truly unsettled them wasn't the body. It was the wall behind him. Carved deep into the steel, written in sharp, deliberate strokes, were words that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. "I've killed more than you've met." And beneath it, a single tally mark. A fresh one. By morning, the world knew. The facility, once considered an impenetrable stronghold, was now a tomb. Government cleanup teams arrived in waves, sweeping through the wreckage with hushed urgency, their boots echoing against the blood-stained floors. The official reports would be vague. An internal security failure, they would call it. A contained breach. But the ones in charge, the men in expensive suits, the ones who gave orders from offices far away from the bloodshed, they knew better. They had spent years pretending Cain didn't exist. And now they had no choice but to acknowledge the ghost that had come back to haunt them. They found no sign of him. No trace. No footprints leading into the desert. No bodies outside the facility. It was like he had never been there at all. But they knew better than to believe that. Cain was out there. And this time, he wasn't hiding. Far from the facility, in a nameless town where no one asked questions, a man sat alone in a dimly lit bar. He wore clean clothes now. A simple jacket, a worn-out shirt. Nothing about him stood out. No one paid him any attention. The bartender leaned against the counter, glancing at him. "Haven't seen you around before." The man shrugged. "Just passing through." The bartender nodded. "What's your name?" For a long moment, the man didn't answer. His fingers traced the rim of his glass, the weight of a name, his old name, settling heavily on his shoulders. Then, finally, he spoke. A new name. A name without ghosts. He smiled, as if testing the way it felt. Doesn't really matter. And for the first time in years it didn't. Later that night, in the privacy of a quiet motel room, the man sat on the edge of the bed. The air was still. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic outside. He pulled off his jacket, then lifted his shirt. His fingers ran over the scars, the tally marks carved into his skin, reminders of every kill, every mission, every life taken in the name of something he no longer believed in. Most of them were old. Faded. But one was fresh. The last one. Slowly, he traced the mark with his fingertip. The only one that ever mattered. The one that meant he had finally killed the man they made him to be. He exhaled, long and slow. Then, without hesitation, he reached for the knife. And one by one, he began erasing the past. By the time the sun rose, the marks were gone. And so was he.